Hi everyone, welcome back, and today we're going to be looking at something that is very helpful when you are trying to get your exposure right, especially in bright sunny conditions when you can't really rely on your LCD screen to get the right exposure. And this is the histogram. The histogram is a graphical representation of how many pixels in your image fall into the various brightness levels. The horizontal axis, the bottom axis, runs from 0 to 255, and 0 stands for pure black and 255 stands for pure white, so from left to right. And then your vertical axis is the one that shows you how many pixels or relative amount of pixels are in your image at that brightness level. Most of the time, our histogram shows us the total brightness level of the whole image. But you can also show a histogram that shows the brightness of each of the primary colors, red, green, and blue. Why do we use histograms? It helps us in judging exposure in bright conditions, but specifically something like clipping. And clipping is a loss of detail that cannot be recovered even in post-production. So when the clipping occurs on the left, it means you are losing shadow detail and you're getting pure blacks. And when the clipping occurs on the right side of the histogram, it means you are losing highlight details. You're going into pure white, and that also cannot be recovered. So you want to make sure as much as possible that your histogram is not touching the left or the right. The second detail that a histogram tells us about is whether your image is overexposed or underexposed. If your graph is pushed to the left, even though it's not touching the extreme left, that might mean that your image is underexposed unless you're shooting something that is dark. And if your histogram is pushed to the right, even though it's not touching the extreme right, it means that your image is possibly overexposed, again, unless you're shooting something that is very bright. So ideally, if you're shooting an image that doesn't have any very dark areas or very bright areas, your histogram should be in the center of the graph. In the case of this image, you can see that I'm shooting this gate, but I'm also shooting the sky, which is very bright. So this is an image that has a very dark area at the bottom and a very bright area at the top. And you can see from the histogram that the dark and the light are represented by a clump of pixels on the left and a clump of pixels on the right, with very little in the middle. And this image actually shows us the third thing that a histogram tells us, and that is the contrast or tonal spread of your image. If your pixels are spread out all the way to the left and to the right, it means that image has a lot of bright and very dark areas in the same image, giving it a high dynamic range. If you have a low contrast image, on the other hand, like this, a brick and ground, then the histogram will show this by having everything in the middle. Now, when you increase or decrease exposure, that will move either to the left or to the right, but the pixels will remain close together to show a low contrast image. And the final thing a histogram shows us is channel blowouts. So if you're shooting something that is very colorful and you want to see whether that particular channel is actually blowing out, even though the entire image looks okay, then you switch to the RGB histogram, and that shows you the individual channels, red, green, and blue, and you can check those individual channels for clipping. As you're shooting, make sure that your histogram is in view. For different cameras, there are different ways of accessing the histogram and showing it on the screen. Once it's on the screen, you compose your shot and you look at, first of all, is anything touching the left or the extreme right, showing that they are either very dark areas that are clipping in the shadows or very bright areas that are clipping in the highlights. And you want to make sure that your tonal spread is somewhere in the middle. So now if you're shooting an image that has this very wide tonal spread or very high dynamic range, like you have a bright sky and something dark that you're trying to shoot, you will then need to make a decision. What's the main subject in the image that you want properly exposed? So you might decide on keeping the dark subject well exposed and blowing out the lighter areas like the sky in your image, or vice versa. You might decide you really want the brighter areas to be in focus and you don't mind if the darker areas clip because those are not important details. If you want both and you want to decrease that tonal spread, then there are some solutions that you can use, and one of them is using a speedlight. So if you're shooting portraits, for example, sometimes this is a problem when you're shooting outside, you have a very bright background and your subject is a bit dark. So you want to use a flash even during the daytime so that you brighten up the darker parts of your image and so reduce that dynamic range and bring everything to the center. And that's it for today, an introduction to the histogram. If you have any questions or experience using the histogram, then put those in the comments, and go ahead and subscribe, like the video and share if this has been useful to you. See you on the next one.